He thought she was just another desperate girl running from her mistakes, but in the next 10 seconds, she was about to change the rules of his world forever. The rain came down in sharp, cold sheets, soaking the city in a restless glow of neon reflections and blurred headlights, as Naomi Carter ran barefoot across the slick marble entrance of the Blackstone Grand, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts that barely kept up with the panic tightening her chest. She didn't belong here. Not in a place where men wore tailored suits worth more than her yearly salary and women moved like they had never known fear. But fear was exactly what chased her. Through those revolving doors, clinging to her spine like ice. Her pulse hammered so loudly she couldn't hear the music spilling from inside. Couldn't hear the soft clink of crystal glasses or the low murmur of power being exchanged over quiet conversations. All she knew was that she had seconds, maybe less, before he caught up to her again. Naomi's hands trembled as she turned blindly, searching for anything, anyone, that could make her invisible, and then she saw him, standing still in the center of it all, untouched by the chaos around him, a man whose presence didn't just command attention, it erased everything else. She didn't think, couldn't think, her instincts moved faster than reason, and in one desperate motion, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against the cool fabric of his dark suit, as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned unstable beneath her feet. The room shifted instantly, though no one said a word. Conversations faded, footsteps slowed, and somewhere behind her, a voice she knew too well cut through the air like a warning she couldn't outrun. But the man she had just clung to didn't react the way anyone else would have. He didn't shove her away or demand an explanation, didn't even move at first, as if he were calculating something far more important than the disruption she caused. Up close, Naomi could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, controlled, unshaken, completely opposite to her own racing heartbeat, and for a brief, fragile moment, the world felt quieter, like the storm outside had been muted by something she didn't understand. She whispered without lifting her head, her voice barely audible. "Please, just for a second, let me stay." It wasn't a plan, it wasn't even a lie, it was the closest thing to truth she had left. The man finally moved then, not to push her away, but to shift slightly, his presence adjusting around her in a way that made it seem intentional, like she belonged exactly where she was standing. And when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, and carried a weight that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "Stay where you are." Those 4 words didn't just reach her, they reached everyone. Naomi didn't need to look to know something had changed. She could feel it in the way the air tightened, in the way the room held its breath, and in the way the fear that had been chasing her suddenly hesitated just long enough for something else to take its place. For the first time since she ran through those doors, she wasn't invisible, she wasn't alone, and she definitely hadn't chosen the right man. But as her fingers tightened slightly against his jacket, she realized something far more dangerous than the man behind her had entered the picture, because the one she had chosen wasn't letting her go. Adrian Moretti did not look down at her right away, but everyone else did, and that was enough to tell Naomi exactly what kind of mistake she had made, because the silence around them was not confusion, it was recognition, the kind that spread quickly through a room filled with people who understood power without needing it explained, and somewhere behind her, the echo of hurried footsteps slowed just slightly, as if uncertainty had crept in where there had once been certainty. Naomi felt it in the tension of her own shoulders, in the way her breath caught halfway through her chest, and in the strange, unsettling calm of the man she was still holding on to, because he had not moved, not even an inch, as if her presence against him was something he had already decided to allow. The polished marble floor beneath her bare feet felt colder now, grounding her in a reality she had tried to escape, and she knew that if she stepped away too soon, everything she had been running from would catch up in an instant. Adrian's gaze shifted then, not toward her, but past her, and whatever he saw there made the air tighten even further, as if the room itself was waiting for his next decision. "You should leave," a voice called out from across the lobby, strained but attempting control, and Naomi's fingers instinctively curled tighter against the fabric of Adrian's jacket as she recognized it. That same voice that had followed her through too many nights, too many arguments, too many moments where she had felt smaller than she deserved to feel. She did not turn around, could not, because facing him meant losing the one fragile shield she had found, even if it was built on a mistake. Adrian finally looked down at her then, his eyes sharp and unreadable, taking in the details she could not hide, the damp curls clinging to her temples, the faint tremor in her hands, the quiet desperation that no amount of pride could fully mask. And for a brief second, something shifted behind that controlled expression, not softness, but awareness. "Do you know him?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. And Naomi shook her head before she could stop herself, the denial automatic, driven by fear rather than truth, and Adrian seemed to understand that without needing clarification. Behind her, the footsteps resumed, closer now, but slower, more cautious, as if whoever approached had begun to realize that the situation was no longer as simple as it had been moments ago. The man stopped several feet away, and Naomi could feel his presence like a shadow pressing at her back, but Adrian did not step aside, did not create space. Instead, he adjusted his stance just enough to place himself fully between her and whatever was coming, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to Naomi, it felt like the ground beneath her shifting into something solid for the first time that night. "She needs to come with me," the voice insisted, less certain now, and Adrian's response came without hesitation, calm and final. No, it was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a weight that settled over the room like a decision already made, and Naomi felt it in the way the tension behind her faltered, in the way the space around them seemed to close ranks without a single visible command. Adrian's hand lifted slightly, not touching her, not holding her in place, but close enough that the message was clear. She was not being dismissed, not being handed back, not being treated like something temporary, and Naomi realized with a quiet, growing shock that she had not just stepped into the wrong place. She had stepped into a situation she did not understand at all. Because the man she had chosen at random was not reacting like a stranger, he was reacting like someone who had already decided she was not going anywhere. The man behind her let out a short, disbelieving breath, the kind that tried to mask frustration with confidence. But it did not carry the same weight it had before, not in a room that no longer belonged to him. And Naomi felt the shift as clearly as if someone had drawn a line across the marble floor separating two very different worlds. "You do not understand," he said, his voice tightening as he took a cautious step forward, careful now, measuring every movement as though he were suddenly aware that he was standing in unfamiliar territory, and Naomi's heartbeat stumbled at the sound, her body instinctively leaning closer to the only barrier between her and everything she had tried to leave behind. Adrian did not move back, did not create distance. Instead, his presence seemed to settle more firmly, like something immovable, something that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. "I understand enough," Adrian replied, his tone even, almost indifferent, but there was a finality in it that did not invite argument, and the man across from them hesitated, his confidence slipping in small, almost invisible ways that only someone desperate would notice. Naomi's fingers curled slightly against Adrian's jacket again, not out of intention this time, but because her body had already made a decision her mind had not caught up to yet, and she hated how natural it felt to stay exactly where she was. "She belongs with me," the man insisted, the words sharper now. Reaching for control he could feel slipping away, and Adrian's gaze sharpened just slightly, enough to signal that the conversation had already gone further than it needed to. "No one belongs to anyone," Adrian said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any raised voice could have, leaving a silence that pressed against the edges of the room like a held breath. Naomi felt something in her chest loosen at those words, something she had not realized she had been carrying for far too long, and for the first time since she had run through those doors, her fears shifted into something else, something unfamiliar but steadier. The man opened his mouth again, then stopped, his eyes flicking briefly to the figures positioned subtly around Adrian, not obvious, not aggressive, but undeniably present, and whatever calculation he made in that moment changed everything, because he stepped back, just half a step, but it was enough. The space between them widened, the tension easing in a way that felt almost unreal, and Naomi realized with quiet disbelief that it was over, at least for now, without the chaos she had braced herself for. "This is not finished," he said finally, the words carrying less certainty than before, and then he turned, the sound of his shoes against the marble floor fading into the background of the hotel's carefully controlled atmosphere. Naomi did not move immediately, did not trust the absence of his presence. Her body still caught between instinct and disbelief, and it was only when the silence settled fully, when the room began to breathe again, that she became aware of how close she still was to Adrian, how her hands had not let go, how the line between necessity and something else had blurred without her permission. Slowly, carefully, she began to pull back, her fingers loosening their hold, her head lifting just enough to break the contact she had used as a shield, and for a moment she could not bring herself to meet his eyes, because she did not know what she would find there: irritation, indifference, or something far more complicated. "I am sorry," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of everything she could not fully explain, and for the first time since this had started, Adrian did not respond immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to make her wonder if she had misunderstood everything, if she had imagined the protection in his actions. But then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, and far too certain. "You are not leaving yet." Naomi froze at his words, her breath catching somewhere between relief and confusion as she finally lifted her gaze to meet his. And for the first time she saw him clearly, not just as a presence or a shield, but as a man whose calm did not come from kindness, but from control, the kind that did not need to be explained because it simply existed. The lobby around them had begun to return to its quiet rhythm, conversations resuming in careful tones, footsteps echoing softly across polished marble, but there was still a distance around them, a subtle space people chose not to cross, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn without anyone announcing it. Naomi became aware of everything at once, the damp fabric clinging to her skin, the faint tremble still lingering in her hands, the reality that she had walked into a situation she did not understand, and yet somehow, she was still standing in it. "I should go," she said quietly, the words automatic, shaped by habit and survival, because leaving had always been the safest choice, even when it meant stepping back into uncertainty. Adrian did not move aside. He studied her instead, not with curiosity, but with a measured attention that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to, as if he were reading more than what she said, more than what she showed. "You ran in here without a plan," he said, his voice steady, not accusing, but certain, and Naomi hesitated, because he was not wrong, but she was not ready to admit how little control she had over what had just happened. "I had a plan," she replied, though it sounded weaker than she intended, and something in his expression shifted slightly, not disbelief, but recognition of the truth she was trying to hold together. "Then your plan failed," he said simply, and there was no judgment in it, only fact, and Naomi felt the weight of that settle deeper than she expected. She glanced toward the entrance, half expecting to see the past she had just escaped waiting for her, but the doors remained closed, the rain still falling beyond them, the city continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. "He will come back," she said under her breath, more to herself than to him, because she knew patterns, knew persistence, knew that leaving did not end things, it only delayed them. Adrian followed her gaze briefly, then returned his attention to her, his posture unchanged, his presence unwavering. "Not here," he said, and the confidence in those two words was not exaggerated. It was absolute, as if the space they stood in operated under rules that did not apply anywhere else. Naomi swallowed, uncertain whether that made her safer or simply placed her in a different kind of risk, because she understood enough to know that power always came with its own cost. "I did not mean to involve you," she added, her voice softer now, the apology more genuine this time, because whatever this man was, whatever world he controlled, she had stepped into it without permission. Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment longer, then shifted slightly as one of the men positioned nearby approached just enough to be acknowledged without interrupting, a silent exchange passing between them that Naomi could not fully read, but could feel in the way the atmosphere adjusted once again. "You did not," Adrian replied finally, his tone calm, deliberate, as if correcting her assumption rather than accepting it, and Naomi frowned slightly, confused by the response, because from her perspective, Everything about this moment had been accidental. Adrian stepped forward then, not closer in a way that crowded her, but in a direction that implied movement, intention, a next step she had not yet considered. "Come with me," he said, and it was not framed as a request, not forced, not urgent, just stated as if it were the most natural continuation of everything that had already happened. Naomi hesitated, her instincts pulling in opposite directions, one urging her to leave, while she still could, the other reminding her that walking away might lead her right back to where she started. And as she stood there, caught between fear and something she could not quite name, she realized that for the first time in a long time, the choice in front of her was not simple, because the man she had run into by accident was not someone you simply walked away from, and deep down, she was starting to understand that he had already decided that for her. Naomi did not move right away, her feet still rooted to the same polished marble that had carried her into this moment, her mind trying to catch up with everything that had shifted in the span of a few minutes. Because nothing about this felt normal, not the silence that followed him, not the way people stepped aside without being told, and certainly not the fact that she was even considering following a man she knew nothing about beyond the quiet authority in his voice. "I do not even know your name," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, not as a challenge, but as something she needed to hold on to, something that made this feel less like she was being pulled into something irreversible. Adrian paused just long enough to glance back at her, his expression unchanged, but his attention fully present in a way that made it clear he had heard every word. "Adrian," he said simply, offering nothing more than that, as if his name alone carried enough weight to explain everything else. And Naomi felt a strange tension settle in her chest at how little it actually did for her, because to her, he was still a stranger, still a risk, just a different kind than the one she had been running from. "Naomi," she replied after a second, her voice quieter now, almost reluctant, because giving her name felt like stepping further into whatever this was becoming, and yet she did not pull back. Adrian nodded once, acknowledging it without repeating it, without questioning it, and then continued forward, expecting her to follow without looking to see if she would. For a moment, Naomi stayed where she was, watching the distance between them grow by a few feet, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her, because leaving meant stepping back into uncertainty, into a world that had already proven it would not protect her, but staying meant trusting something she did not understand, something she had not chosen. The rain outside intensified, tapping softly against the tall glass windows like a reminder that the night was far from over, and Naomi drew in a slow breath before finally stepping forward, her bare feet making quiet contact with the cold floor as she closed the space between them. Adrian did not acknowledge her movement directly, but his pace adjusted slightly, just enough that she did not have to rush to keep up, and that small, almost unnoticeable shift made something in her chest tighten in a way she could not explain. They moved through the lobby with an ease that did not belong to her, past people who avoided direct eye contact, past staff who seemed to anticipate his presence without being told, until they reached a private corridor that felt removed from the rest of the building, quieter, more controlled, as if the world outside those walls did not quite reach this far. Naomi hesitated at the entrance, her instincts flaring again, because this was where things changed, where stepping forward meant leaving behind the last piece of familiarity she had left, even if that familiarity had been chaos. "You can still leave," Adrian said without turning around, his voice calm, almost neutral, but there was something deliberate in the way he said it, as if he were giving her a choice he already knew the answer to. Naomi looked back over her shoulder, toward the lobby, toward the doors that led back to the rain, to the uncertainty, to the version of her life she had been trying to escape, and for a moment, she considered it, truly considered walking away while she still could. But then she thought about the way her name had sounded when he said nothing about it, the way he had stepped in without asking for anything in return, the way he had said no without hesitation when she could not say it for herself, and slowly, almost without realizing it, she turned back toward him. "I know," she said softly, and then she stepped into the corridor, crossing a line she could not uncross, following a man she did not know into a world she was only beginning to understand, and behind her, the quiet of the lobby resumed as if nothing had happened at all, as if the moment that had just changed everything existed only for her and the man who had not once looked back to see if she would follow, because he already knew she would. The corridor felt different the moment Naomi stepped fully inside, the noise of the lobby fading behind her as if a door had closed on the world she understood, replaced by a quiet that was not peaceful but controlled, deliberate, the kind that made every sound more noticeable, every movement more intentional, and she became suddenly aware of her own footsteps, soft and uncertain against the carpeted floor as she followed a man who moved like he had walked this path 1,000 times without ever questioning where it led. Adrian did not slow down or look back, but there was a precision to his pace that made it easy to follow, as if he had already accounted for her presence, already adjusted for it without needing to acknowledge it directly, and that realization unsettled her more than if he had given her instructions. The walls were lined with muted tones and soft lighting, nothing overly extravagant, but everything carefully chosen, the kind of place that did not need to display wealth because it assumed it. And Naomi felt out of place in a way she had not in the lobby, because here, there was no distraction, no crowd to disappear into, only space and silence and the growing awareness that she had crossed into something private. They stopped in front of a door that looked no different from the others, but when Adrian reached for the handle, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if even the air recognized that this space belonged entirely to him. He opened the door without hesitation and stepped inside, then paused just enough for her to follow, not inviting, not forcing, simply allowing the moment to exist for her to choose again. Naomi hesitated on the threshold, her instincts flaring one more time, because this was not a public space anymore, not something she could justify as temporary or accidental. This was a line that separated safety from something far less defined, and for a second, she considered turning around, retracing her steps back to the lobby, back to the rain, back to the uncertainty she at least understood. But then she remembered the way her name had sounded in the silence, the way he had said no without raising his voice, the way he had not asked anything from her in return, and slowly, she stepped inside. The room was large but not overwhelming, clean lines, dark wood, a view of the city stretching beyond tall windows where the rain traced thin lines of silver against the glass, and everything about it felt composed, intentional, like the man who stood just a few feet ahead of her. Adrian closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing more than it should have, marking a shift she could not ignore, and Naomi felt her shoulders tighten slightly as the reality settled in. She was alone with him now, completely removed from everything else, and yet the fear she expected did not come back the way it had before. Instead, there was a cautious stillness, awaiting. Adrian moved toward a side table, pouring a glass of water without asking, then setting it down within reach, but not pressing it into her hands. The gesture simple, almost ordinary, and somehow that made it more disarming than anything else. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but as a suggestion grounded in certainty, and Naomi hesitated only a moment before lowering herself onto the edge of a chair, her posture still tense, her eyes tracking him carefully as if she was trying to understand the rules of a game she had not agreed to play. "You are not afraid of the right things," Adrian said after a moment, his voice quiet, observant, and Naomi frowned slightly, unsure whether that was meant as criticism or something else entirely. "I am afraid of enough," she replied, her voice steadier now, though her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap, and Adrian studied her for a second longer before nodding slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. "Then you should know," he said, his tone shifting just enough to carry weight. "The man you ran from will not stop because you asked him to." Naomi's breath caught at that, not because she did not know it, but because hearing it said out loud made it real in a way she could not deny, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched again, heavy with everything she had been trying not to think about. "But he will stop here," Adrian added calmly, and Naomi looked up at him, searching his expression for something that explained how he could say that with such certainty, how he could make a promise without calling it one. And as she sat there, in a room that did not belong to her, in a situation she had never planned for, she realized that whatever this man was, whatever world he controlled, he was not offering her a way out. He was offering something else entirely, something she had not expected and did not yet understand, but could not ignore. Naomi sat very still, her fingers slowly loosening around each other as the silence settled into something heavier than before, not uncomfortable, but undeniable, like a truth waiting to be acknowledged, and she realized that for the first time that night, she was not reacting, she was thinking, and that alone felt unfamiliar. The rain outside traced steady lines down the glass, the city lights blurring into soft reflections that made everything feel distant, removed, like the world she had come from was already further away than it should have been, and the man standing a few feet from her was the only thing that felt immediate, real, impossible to ignore. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but clear, because she needed to understand the terms of whatever this was, needed something that made sense in a situation that had none. Adrian did not answer right away, his gaze resting on her with the same measured attention, as if he were considering not the question itself, but what it meant that she had asked it, and Naomi held that silence, refusing to look away this time, because she was no longer just the woman who had run into his arms, she was the one who had chosen to stay. "I did not say I was helping you," Adrian replied after a moment, his tone calm, almost neutral, and Naomi felt a flicker of confusion at that, because everything he had done suggested otherwise. Everything from the lobby to this room had pointed to protection, to intervention, to something deliberate. "Then what is this?" she pressed, her voice gaining a little strength, not challenging, but searching, and Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not softer, but more defined, as if he had reached a conclusion she had not yet seen. "You walked into my space," he said, each word precise, intentional, "and you made it clear you could not walk back out safely." Naomi felt that settle over her, not as a dismissal, but as a statement of fact, and she could not deny it, not after everything that had happened, not after the way her instincts had led her straight into him without hesitation. "That does not explain why you did not push me away," she said, her voice quieter again, because that was the part she could not reconcile, the part that did not fit into anything she understood about people, especially men like him. Adrian's gaze held hers, steady and unbroken, and for a second, the room felt smaller, the distance between them more significant than the few feet that separated them. "Because you did not act like someone looking for attention," he said, and Naomi blinked slightly at that, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. "You acted like someone who needed it." The words were not emotional, not softened, but they carried a clarity that made something in her chest tighten unexpectedly, because no one had ever said it like that before, no one had ever seen the difference. She looked down for a moment, processing that, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her expression, less fear, more awareness. "So what happens now?" she asked, and this time the question was not about escape. It was about direction, about what came after the moment she had been surviving. Adrian moved then, not closer, but enough to shift the space between them, his presence grounding the room in a way that felt deliberate. "Now," he said calmly, "you stop running in circles." Naomi let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, the tension easing just slightly from her shoulders, because for the first time, someone was not telling her to leave, not telling her to handle it alone, not telling her to be careful. He was telling her to stop, and that felt more unfamiliar than anything else. She studied him for another moment, taking in the steadiness, the control, the certainty that did not waver, and she realized something that shifted everything again, because whatever this man was offering, it was not temporary, it was not casual, it was not something she could step in and out of. It was a line, clear and defined, and once crossed, it did not lead back to where she had come from. And as she sat there, no longer trembling, no longer trying to disappear, Naomi understood that the most dangerous part of this night was not the man she had run from. It was the one who had decided she was not going anywhere, and the part of her that was beginning to accept that without pulling away. Naomi sat in the quiet, her thoughts no longer racing but settling into something slower, heavier, as if the storm that had driven her here had finally reached a point where it could not push her any further. And for the first time, she was not thinking about escape. She was thinking about what staying actually meant. The room felt warmer now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the tension that had once filled every inch of her body had begun to loosen, replaced by a cautious awareness that this moment was no longer about survival alone, it was about choice. Adrian remained where he was, not watching her constantly, not hovering, but present in a way that did not fade into the background, his silence carrying more weight than most conversations ever could. And Naomi realized that he was giving her something she had not expected, space to think without pressure, space to decide without being forced. She looked down at her hands, still slightly damp, still marked by the remnants of the panic that had brought her here, and slowly, she unclasped them, letting them rest naturally in her lap, a small gesture that felt larger than it should have. "If I stay," she said quietly, not looking up yet, "this does not just end tomorrow, does it?" It was not really a question, more an acknowledgement of something she was beginning to understand, and Adrian's response came without hesitation. "No," he said simply. There was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to make it easier to accept, just the truth, direct and unfiltered, and Naomi felt that settle into place with a strange sense of clarity. She lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes again, and this time she did not look away, because she needed to see what she was stepping into, needed to understand what kind of man made decisions like this without asking for anything in return. "Then why me?" she asked, her voice steady now, stronger than it had been before, because this was no longer about fear. It was about understanding her place in something she had not chosen but was beginning to accept. Adrian considered her for a moment, his expression unchanged but his focus sharper, as if he were measuring not just her question, but the way she held herself now, the difference between the woman who had run into him and the one sitting in front of him. "Because you stayed," he said finally, and Naomi blinked slightly, caught off guard by the answer, because it was both simple and complex in a way she could not immediately unpack. "You could have left in the lobby," he continued, his voice calm, almost reflective. "You could have walked away when the door opened, and you could still walk out now." Naomi felt the truth of that settle deep within her, because he was right. Every step she had taken since that moment had been a choice, even if it had not felt like one at the time, and yet she was still here, still sitting across from him, still listening. "But you did not," Adrian finished, and the finality of those words did not trap her. It defined something she had not been able to see clearly until now. Naomi let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the realization took shape, because for the first time in a long time, she was not being pulled or pushed, she was choosing, and that choice carried weight, consequence, direction. She stood slowly, the movement unhurried, deliberate, and Adrian did not react, did not question it. Simply watched as she took a step toward the window, looking out at the city that stretched endlessly below, lights reflecting off rain-soaked streets, people moving through lives that had nothing to do with hers, and she wondered, briefly, what it would feel like to return to that, to disappear back into something ordinary. But the thought did not hold the same pull it once did. "If I stay," she said again, softer this time, more certain, "then I do not want to keep running, not from him, not from anything." Adrian's response came just as steady. "Then you will not," he said, and there was something in his voice now, not warmth, not softness, but a certainty that felt like a line being drawn, a decision being made not just by him, but by both of them. Naomi nodded once, a small, quiet motion, but it carried everything she needed to say, and as she turned back from the window, she understood something that changed the shape of the entire night, because she had not just found a place to hide, she had stepped into something that demanded she stand still, something that required her to stop being afraid in the way she had always been, and as she faced him again, no longer uncertain, no longer retreating, she realized that the most unexpected part of all of this was not that he refused to let her go, it was that she was no longer trying to leave. The rain had not stopped by the time Naomi turned away from the window, but something inside her had. The restless instinct that had pushed her from place to place, from fear to fear, had quieted into something steadier, something that did not feel like surrender, but like decision, and as she faced Adrian again, there was no hesitation left in the way she held herself. The distance between them remained the same, but it no longer felt like uncertainty. It felt intentional, a space neither of them needed to close for the moment to hold its meaning. Adrian watched her with that same composed focus, but there was a subtle shift now, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the absence of resistance, as if he had been waiting not for her to speak, but for her to arrive at this point on her own. Naomi took a small step forward, not rushed, not uncertain, and though it was only a few inches, it carried more weight than anything she had done since she entered the building. "I am not asking you to fix anything," she said quietly, her voice clear, grounded. "And I am not asking you to take responsibility for me." Adrian did not interrupt, did not correct her, simply listened, and that alone gave her the space to continue. "But I am done pretending I can handle everything by myself," she added, and the truth in those words did not weaken her. It strengthened something she had been forced to hide for too long. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had changed between them in a single night, and Adrian nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more agreement than any long explanation could have. "Good," he said, his tone even, but firm, because that was never going to work. There was no judgment in it, only certainty, and Naomi felt something in her chest settle fully for the first time, because she did not have to defend herself here, did not have to prove anything beyond what was already clear. Adrian moved then, crossing the space between them just enough to stand beside her rather than across from her, not invading, not claiming, simply aligning their positions in a way that felt deliberate, and Naomi noticed the shift immediately, the difference between being observed and being included. "From this point on," he said calmly, his gaze directed toward the rain-streaked city beyond the glass, "you do not run unless I tell you to." Naomi let out a soft breath at that, not because the words were restrictive, but because they were structured, defined, something she could understand in a world that had always been unpredictable. "And you do not go back to him," Adrian continued, his voice steady, leaving no space for doubt, and Naomi nodded without hesitation, because that part of the decision had already been made the moment she stepped into this room. The city lights flickered slightly through the rain, distant and untouchable, and Naomi realized that everything she had known was still out there, unchanged, waiting, but it no longer held the same power over her, not when she had chosen something different. "You understand what this means," Adrian said after a moment, finally turning his attention back to her, and Naomi met his gaze without flinching, without looking away. "Yes," she replied, and though the word was simple, it carried everything, the risk, the uncertainty, the unknown path ahead, but also the clarity she had been missing for so long. Adrian studied her for a second longer, then gave a slight nod, the kind that did not need to be explained, and in that quiet exchange, something settled into place between them, not defined by promises or conditions, but by understanding. Naomi did not step back, did not retreat, because there was nowhere she wanted to go that was not forward, and as the rain continued to fall outside, washing the city in soft reflections, she realized that the night had not ended the way it began. She had not escaped into safety. She had stepped into something stronger, something that did not ask her to disappear, but to stand still and be seen. And as the silence settled around them once more, it was no longer heavy with fear, but grounded in something far more powerful, because in a world where power often erased people like her, she had been chosen not to be overlooked, not to be dismissed, but to remain. And that was the moment everything truly changed, not with noise or force, but with a quiet decision that neither of them would undo. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.